The video that you're about to watch is, fair warning, rather long. It's a lot longer than most of the things that you're going to find in this space. It was a request from a beekeeping supplier that I work with for the bees that I've been managing over the past several years. The honey came from his family honey operation, and it is a walkthrough of the process for a standard strength and sack strength traditional mead. I hope you find it to be useful, and good luck. Welcome back. We got our standard strength mead underway. Yeast is pitched, and probably in the next 12 to 24 hours, we'll start to see some activity through the airlock. And that's actually a good point. Airlock activity is not really an indication of fermentation. Yes, it's an early sign, but it doesn't really tell you when the mead is done. So, how do you know? Well, the best way to know is to take a sample in the hydrometer that I showed you at the beginning of this video. And when your gravity readings are the same for 3 consecutive days, it means that fermentation is probably complete, at which point you're ready to move on to the next steps. Now, with the use of a refractometer, again, one of these, oh, and incidentally, this is a wine and beer refractometer, not a honey refractometer. They measure things at a different point on the Brick scale, and they serve different purposes. So if you're going to use one of these, you can't use your honey refractometer. So with the refractometer, once alcohol is in solution in the mead, meaning some fermentation has taken place, there is an inaccuracy in the way that light passes through the prism. That is caused by the fact that there's alcohol in there, which has a lower index of refraction. So it causes the readings to be higher than they normally should be. There is a calculation that you can apply to compensate for that. It's not 100% accurate, but it does get you pretty darn close to the correct value. Because of these small volumes, I would be using this, applying the calculation, and then if I'm getting stable readings over 3 days, I know I'm really done. Chances are for the standard mead, it's going to take about 2 weeks to ferment out. For this one, the sack strength mead, it may take up to a month to completely ferment. So it all depends on just how things go. Temp control wise, I'm not going to apply temp control to these batches. Normally for a small batch like this, I would put them into a small wine refrigerator, which can be set at 2 different temperature ranges depending on what I'm doing. But because right now, the time of the year that it is and where I happen to live, my basement temperature is 62 degrees. And so it's actually perfect for doing ambient fermentations of this type with this particular yeast strain. The yeast and all the other ingredients and things that we've talked about here are going to be sort of in an index at the end of the video, so you'll have reference to that along with the recipe and the process steps to allow you to repeat what we've done here fairly easily. In addition, I will include a glossary of some of the terms that we've applied, and realizing that maybe they're not fully understandable to people who haven't made mead before or beer. So hopefully that'll all be covered. If they're not, you can reach out to me through Facebook or the Minnesota Homebrewers Facebook page, or through the Modern Mead Makers group, and hopefully we can get you some answers. So let's take a little drink, because it takes a lot of beer or mead to make mead. And then let's move on to the next batch. So I've pre-weighed 3.5 pounds of this orange blossom honey from California, which by the way is really nice honey. It's one of the better orange blossoms that I've had in my limited experience. And to that then, we know that we need to add about 0.7 gallons of the RO water. And I'm going to go with about a half gallon because I want to make sure I have enough headspace at the end to add my oxygen. And while we're doing this, let's talk about oxygen. So if you want to make excellent mead, you really have to add oxygen through a stone, as I did prior to this, because it ensures a healthy fermentation. But of course, when you're first starting out, you have limited equipment, you don't exactly know if you're going to stick with it or how serious you want to be about it. So including oxygen as part of your regimen may be kind of out of the picture. If that's the case, the best thing you can do is, before you put the airlock on, get your gloves on and sanitize the surface of your gloves, and then, clamp your hand on top of the opening and then just really shake it around, open it up again, let some air in, shake it around some more. Do this, 4 or 5 times, and it'll allow the must to pick up oxygen from the atmosphere and be absorbed into solution. The best you're going to do there is, at best, 8 parts per million, probably closer to 6 parts per million. Ideally, for a mead of this strength, you want 10 parts per million, but it'll get you going. You'll probably make a fairly good and drinkable mead, and if that's all you got available, just do the best you can. With a sack strength mead like this, there really is no substitute for oxygen, in my opinion, as far as yeast health is concerned. I don't think I would attempt to make a mead of this size without it. So do what you will, just understand your results may vary. All right, so while that honey is dissolving into the water, let's go back now and measure out our Go Firm. And again now, because I'm pitching more yeast, and coincidentally, the amount of yeast that was left from the previous batch is 1.4 grams, and the amount of yeast in a package is 5 grams, and it just so happens that I need 6.4 grams for this batch. So that's perfect. I mean, how often does that work out? So I can pitch that without any measurement, and then I just need to measure out my Go Firm here. And for this, I need 8 grams. So let's get that into the beaker. And here again, if you're going to do this more than once, get some good tools. Get a scale that lets you get down to 0.01 grams for these types of measurements. It's really indispensable. You can overshoot a little bit, and there are some calculators on the internet that will tell you what a teaspoon weighs of Go Firm or Fermaid O, and you can certainly approximate that way. This is not rocket science. It doesn't have to be that precise, but where you have the opportunity to get precise, it's kind of nice to do. All right, I'm going to put my tools into the sanitizer and put that aside. Oh, actually, I think what I'm going to do there now is add my hot water, because it's going to take a little while to cool down. This is, again, RO water. I need about 160 milliliters of the hot RO water. I'll let that kind of mix in a little bit. And then we can move on to some of our other additions, which will come later, one of which is Go Firm. And again, we're just going to do the first day of addition. This is 0.7 grams. So we'll get that in here. And then we want to add our FT Blanc Soft. If you don't have access to these, don't want to spend the money on them, you can do without. Your mead just probably won't come out with as much structure and richness as it otherwise could have. Not the end of the world. So for FT Blanc Soft, I want 0.83, and of course re-tear. And then for Opti White, I want 0.88 grams. So these are pretty small amounts, but they really do the job. And finally, the wine tannin, which in this case will be 0.2 grams, so very little. And definitely with wine tannin, go less rather than more. Okay, so we have all those. And a little warm water. About 150 milliliters here. I'll get that mixed in a bit. I made myself a little stir bar for these types of applications. It's a piece of 304 stainless steel rod with some shrink tube on the bottom to keep it from scratching things, and it's quite handy for reaching down into tall flasks, 1 gallon jugs, etc. You definitely want to use stainless for obvious reasons. There's still some honey here that's not dissolved, so this may take a little while. For this small batch, I'm not using my stirring rod as you saw at the beginning of the first batch. It's not necessary. It certainly could be used, but for this little bit, it's not a big deal. When you're dealing with 5 gallons of must and 20 pounds of fruit, well, then it's an indispensable tool, trust me. So on that topic, fruit meads, and for that matter, metheglins, which are spiced meads, are not covered in this first video. We'll come back to that at another time. There will be more of these videos available. I'm currently working on one for a presentation with the American Mead Makers Association, and that should be out sometime in April. So you can come back to that and look at some possible techniques for hydromels made with berries in this particular instance. So we can cover that there, and if you want, I would encourage you to check it out. Another thing that we need to do while this continues to dissolve is sanitize our fermenter. And one of the things about star sand is it gets very foamy. That's actually part of the product. They put some sort of a foaming agent in there to ensure that it clings to and contacts all of the various surfaces, whether they're shaped or cut or whatever. So that's how you know you did a good job of getting the sanitizer everywhere it needs to go. This is an acid-based sanitizer, and one of the things we say in the homebrew community is don't fear the foam. So we'll pour it off. There's a little bit of foam left in there. It's no big deal. It's completely tasteless unless you have really, really large quantities, and I mean a high concentration. You'll never know what's in there, and it won't affect the fermentation or do anything bad to your meat. So don't worry about this. It will be fine as is. And we should check the temperature of our fermade, our go-ferm rather. And make sure that's on Fahrenheit. above where we want to be, so we're going to let that come down for a bit. And let's keep getting this mixed in, and then we'll be ready to add that to our fermenter. That looks better. Okay, we'll come back to this in a moment after everything's all mixed in and we're at temperature. We're back. Well, my GoFirm solution is almost at temperature, meaning very nearly 95 degrees. And so while that's coming down the last few tenths, let's get fully sanitized here. And pour off the last of our little bit of sanitizer as best we can. Not a big deal, but hey, if I can get it out of there, that works for me. And we'll put our must in here. This should be fully dissolved with any luck. One of the things you really don't want when you're making mead is to have chunks of crystallized sugars sitting on the bottom of the fermenter, because there's a pretty good chance it just won't ferment out. Maybe in enough time it would, but let's say in the course of 2 to 3 weeks, it's probably going to be still sitting down on the bottom there. And of course, if it does completely ferment out, eventually, your gravity readings or the strength of your mead is not going to be particularly accurate because you didn't measure that when you did your checks. Now, when you have a GoFirm solution like this, you don't want to let it sit more than 15 minutes after the yeast has been pitched, unless you are attemperating it. And what that means is you're bringing the temperature in line with the must temperature. So with the first one we did here earlier, the temperature of this was pretty close to the must temperature. They were about 10 degrees apart, and that's perfectly fine. Right now they're about 20 degrees apart. So we're going to get our yeast in here, get it mixed and let it bloom. And then we're going to check temperatures of both solutions before we add them together. And I'm assuming that they will not be the same or close enough, and I'll show you how we attemperate the GoFirm solution. Okay, we're going to let that sit about 5 minutes to bloom. Then we'll come back, check temperatures, and I'll show you the next step. All right, well, it's been about 5 minutes. The yeast has bloomed relatively well. We're currently at 91 degrees on the thermometer. And let's see where we are. Uh-oh. And this is at 71 degrees, so we're about 20 degrees apart. So this is where the attemperation piece comes in. For this, we will add some of the must directly to the yeast mixture. We try not to add too much because I don't want the temperature to change too rapidly. Let me try to get this up about 4 or 5 degrees. Get it mixed in, let it sit for a few minutes, and repeat this process until we're within 10 degrees of the two temperatures. So that dropped at about 5 degrees, which is pretty much what was expected. It was about 50% of the original volume. So we're going to let this sit for a couple minutes, then we'll come back to it again, and then we should be ready to pitch our yeast. All right, well, We're getting pretty close, so we're going to add a little more. And then we'll let that sit for a couple of minutes. And then we'll be ready to pitch our yeast. Okay, we are within 10 degrees now. However, I want to let this sit for just a little bit to let the yeast acclimate to the new temperature. And then in a few minutes we will put that into our must, and then we'll top up our volumes and check the gravity. One of the things that I want to mention is this method works pretty well for me. There's a lot of ways to do things. You do what you want to do. Nobody should be able to tell you different. I believe in the science and more modern mead making methods. I don't use raisins as nutrients. And this approach has allowed me to compete pretty well in competitions. So take it or leave it, do what you want, but this works for me. Give it a try and see what you think. No doubt somebody out there's got some things that they think I did incorrectly or would have done differently. That's fine. Feel free to share those with me. I have no problem with that. I'm always looking for improvements. There's a lot of things I didn't do here that I probably would do if I was doing this strictly for myself. But I wanted to keep this pretty basic and simple, use readily available ingredients, and give you a reasonably solid introduction to making basic traditional meads. So let's see where this ends up, and then we'll check our gravity. We're now within just a few degrees of the must temperature, so I don't really need that anymore. Let's go ahead and add that to the must. All right, we still have just a little bit headspace, and that's perfectly good for me because I now want to make sure I get some oxygen into the must, and that is going to foam a little bit. So let's get that done, and then we can top it up and finalize. And wow. Yeah, this is the problem with adding oxygen, is it does tend to foam a little bit. So you gotta keep an eye on it. We're gonna stop there for a minute and let everything settle down. Then we'll come back and check gravity. Okay, while we were waiting, I went ahead and added a little more oxygen to this, so we have about 30 seconds worth at maybe a cubic foot per minute or so. I don't really have a good way to measure that. I just use a very low flow, and I'm pretty confident it's in that range. And you can get oxygen regulators that tell you how many cubic feet per minute your pushing out. So if you want to do that, feel free. Let us now see if we can get a gravity reading using the refractometer. And we are at about 1.125, and the recipe said 1.22.5 was the target. So when I top up the remaining water, it's probably going to be really, really, really close to my prediction. And so let's clean this off. Let's top it up a little bit and take another reading just to see if we really land there. That's about as far as I want to go, because again, I need a little headspace in case it foams a bit during fermentation. The recipe accounts for that in the volume predictions, so we are right where we need to be. Let's see what we get now. Come on. The foam is pulling all of the must off my probe here. Yep, we are now at like 1.122. I'll show you this in the film. That is surprisingly close to the prediction. Just using the kind of accepted standard of customary sugar content in honey gets you so close. It's not worth concerning yourself about whether this particular varietal or that varietal has more or less sugar content in it. I'm sure there are variations. I have noticed them occasionally when I'm working with certain types of honey, but overall it's plenty close enough for this kind of work. This is not high precision engineering, and I would say it's perfectly adequate. So at this point, our first end of the process is complete, and tomorrow we'll come back and we'll add some nutrients, and of course our volume is going to climb a little bit as we do that. So if we reach a point where there's not enough headspace left, we may have to pull some of it off to make room, but we'll deal with that when we get there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good morning. Well, we're about 14 hours after the initial yeast pitch, and I've pre-measured the Fermaid O for our standard strength mead, and I'll be measuring the other one out here before we get going too far. I'm about to add that, and one of the things that I mentioned previously is that you need to be cautious once fermentation has started, so that CO2 that's dissolved into solution doesn't come out of solution when you stir it or add particulate matter. So I've got my oxygenation wand here. I'm going to prime it a little with some oxygen. It's in my sanitizer solution, and make sure everything's fully sanitized here. And then we're going to use this to do our stirring, but I'm going to stir a little bit before I add any oxygen. because once that oxygen starts flowing and there's CO2 in solution, it's going to want to get out of there. So as a caution, I have a tub here just because, yes, things happen. So doesn't look like it's going to be a big problem. All right, let's add our nutrient dose. So this is the second dose now on day 2. And give it some oxygen, which is going to flow really quick. So we're going to probably have to sneak up on this a little bit because there's not a lot of headspace. And we don't need a lot of oxygen at this point, just a little dose is good. And again, if you don't have or don't want to invest in an oxygen tank and a wand, stirring much like I'm doing here with a small stainless rod or something similar, but giving it a pretty aggressive stir to get some oxygen into the surface area here is going to help your yeast at this stage of the game. Once we're past the first 24 hours, it's probably not advisable. I believe the science says you can go up to about 48 hours. I don't like to push that envelope because I want really, really clean fermentation. So I do the best I can in the first 24 hours and then I call it done. All right, I think we're going to have to live with that. Airlock back on there, and we'll move on to the next batch. So we're shooting for 0.7 here. Didn't quite make it. It's roughly 1/4 of a teaspoon. Oh, there we go, that's close enough. And we'll get that mixed together and then we'll add it. Okay, we are ready to add the next dose of nutrient to the sack strength mead. Once again, I'll prime my oxygen wand and sanitizer. Give it a little stir initially just to make sure I'm not going to have a problem. Looks good. Get that nutrient in there. And even though I'm adding a very small amount, as you can see, the volume is starting to grow, so we're just going to assess that as we go here. And hit it with some oxygen. That's about the best we're going to do here. Okay, well, we're done with that. Get my airlock back in place. And we come back tomorrow and add the next dose. And at that point, we'll sit for a few days and let it ferment. So we'll keep checking progress and we'll see you tomorrow.